engine running.
Absolute genius.
Get this.
Welcome.
This is the show where we bring you
Science.
What that essentially means is
discoveries,
Advances.
questions,
Research.
technology.
Unbelievable.
Without further ado,
This is The Naked Scientists.
Hello, and welcome to the Naked Scientist podcast, the show that brings you the biggest breakthroughs and talks to the major movers and shakers in the worlds of science, technology, and medicine, with me, Rachel Ralph. Coming up, experts express concern over a sharp rise in children's mental health referrals. But what is driving the increase? Also, hola, guten tag, konnichiwa. We discuss bilingualism and find out how our brains are able to interpret different languages. Plus, a new study reveals where we might be going wrong when we recycle our household waste. England's Children's Commissioner, Rachel de Souza, has warned that the country is facing a crisis after more than 1 million children were referred to its mental health services. A new report says numbers are up by 10% on last year, and there are now around twice as many referrals for children and young people than there were 8 years ago. But what is driving it? And do we see similar trends elsewhere? I went to meet Barbara Sahakian, a professor of clinical neuropsychology and an expert in ADHD at the University of Cambridge. Barbara has just returned from the International College of Neuropsychopharmacology, or CINP, Congress in Glasgow.
There's increases across a number of different mental health disorders, in particular anxiety, but also depression. Those are very common mental health disorders. And then there's also increased diagnoses of autism and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD.
And what do we think is driving these?
Well, there's probably a number of drivers, and they may be different for different things. I mean, one thing that has been pointed out is, internet use and social media, where people are trying to fit into perfect mold of what they think they should look like and things like that. There's also some bullying that goes on, and so there's exposure to things like pornography, which young people shouldn't be seeing. So there's a whole lot of factors that way. I work particularly in ADHD quite a lot, and there we see that there's a number of different factors, including, the sort of parental styles, the fact that we're using technology much more, which means we switch our attention very rapidly from, looking at our phones or looking at something very quickly, short videos on our phones, and then maybe using the computer or doing something else, rather than focusing our attention for long periods of time in order to get a goal done. So, like homework or something really important. So that's actually probably producing a lot of problems, because it's been shown in studies that if students have their phone and they're getting messages or something on their phones during a lecture, they don't do as well as people who don't have their phones with them. And also, even there's a study which shows that just having your phone, even if it's not on, sort of generates a kind of anxiety. People want to keep checking it, even though it's sitting there and it's off. So there's a lot of that that's causing probably very rapid switching of attention and distraction. And that, of course, is the type of thing that you might see in attention deficit hyperactivity disorder.
So one of the statistics that was mentioned by Rachel de Souza, the Children's Commissioner for England, was that there was almost a 50% increase since 2018/2019 in mental health problems. So do you think COVID has impacted this at all?
It definitely seems to have affected quite a few of the mental health disorders, certainly exacerbated people who already had the symptoms, got worse during that time. And obviously, you can imagine how maybe obsessive-compulsive disorder might have increased, because everybody was worried about, catching something, and everybody was washing their hands and making sure that everything was, clean. So that may also have effects on that. And anxiety as well, because obviously a lot of people were anxious, and a lot of people experienced bereavement during that period. So that would also lead to possibly to depression if you didn't have it dealt with effectively, So definitely there was that. We actually did our own study where we looked at people during the COVID-19 pandemic, and we did see that those people who were less socially connected actually had increased symptoms of depression in terms of negative thoughts and biases, that kind of thing. And so people really did much better if they had some kind of social connection. I've also written about a very critical group, which is the 1 to 5-year-olds, because that's the time during which social cognition develops. And if you didn't have a sibling during that time, and if your parents were busy, say, trying to work from home or do something like that, and they were actually engaged and couldn't interact with you, but you also wouldn't have had many peers if you didn't have a sibling, they wouldn't have been, developing theory of mind and the sort of sharing and cognitive processes, empathy, the types of things that you develop with social cognition during that period of time. And certainly teachers have reported that when they come into the sort of nursery and primary schools, that they're sometimes slightly more aggressive, and they don't want to share toys, and there's a lot more problems in social interaction.
And I guess economic inequalities also play into this, because for those teenagers or children that were at home during the lockdown, if they didn't have access to a good computer or the internet, then they would have also struggled to communicate with friends during the pandemic.
Yes, I'm sure that's the case. I mean, they usually do with most things. One of my favorite studies that I've done was published in Psychological Medicine, and it really looked at reading for pleasure in young children. And those children, and we use the ABCD study database, which is a USA study. And what we showed is that those children who read early in life for pleasure, when they were adolescents, they had better mental health, less symptoms of depression, they had less symptoms of inattention, better school attainment, better cognition, and actually better brain structure. So it's really important, and I raised it because we actually looked at socioeconomic status in that study, and regardless of socioeconomic status, you got the benefits. So those children who read for pleasure early had all those benefits that accrued in adolescence, and probably they'd keep them lifelong. So this very small intervention can be really important later on.
You mentioned this study was in America, so the statistics that have been published recently this week are for the UK, and are we seeing this increase in mental health problems in other areas of the world as well?
Yes, while I was in CIMP, I did a session with Tom Insel, and I mentioned this problem of increasing mental health problems in young people. And he said basically the same was happening over in the USA.
And are we seeing this with adults as well?
Well, I've been focusing on attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and I'm just about to publish with Christelle Langley a paper in the Journal of Psychopharmacology. And what we saw was that actually they are rising for ADHD diagnosis and prescriptions. They're rising a lot in adults as well. And the interesting thing is, in 2025, that was the first time that it was actually greater prescriptions and for adults than for children. So yes, it's increasing. The other interesting statistic there was we think of it as a neurodevelopmental problem, ADHD, and we know that usually there's 4 boys to 1 girl gets diagnosed. But in the adult population, it's virtually 1 to 1.
Barbara Sahakian at the University of Cambridge. Norovirus, which is also known as the winter vomiting bug, is an illness that causes vomiting, nausea, stomach pain, and diarrhea. It is relatively uncommon but highly unpleasant and contagious, with no approved vaccine or antiviral therapy. In low and middle income countries, it kills 200,000 people a year, and mostly young children. But a recent study identified an antibody, immunoglobulin A, that helps the immune system defend against norovirus infections. Yale University's Craig Weiland has been telling Chris Smith about it.
Yeah, so we're really interested in this virus called norovirus, which is a tiny virus that causes a big problem, which is severe vomiting and diarrhea. It's also commonly called the cruise ship virus. And the big problem we're trying to address is how can we prevent this virus from causing disease? And ultimately, how can we make a vaccine or a drug to prevent infection and prevent these symptoms? Because it's a major global public health problem that no one wants. Currently, there's no solutions, there's no vaccines, and there's no drugs for it.
It is a big problem, isn't it? Because, I mean, if you look at an average country like the UK, it's probably millions of cases per year. Most of them, most people are not aware of because it's a 24-hour thing, isn't it? It's short and sweet, but not sweet.
Typically, we say that people are getting infected every 3 to 4 or 5 years. Sometimes you don't get symptoms, but across the globe, there's probably 500 to 800 million infections every single year. There's many different types of human norovirus that cause infection. So it's ubiquitous, but poorly understood.
Given that ubiquity, why don't we make a lifelong immune response to it? In the same way that if I ran into measles, thankfully I had a vaccine, but if I ran into measles and caught that, I wouldn't catch it again probably. Why is it not like that for noro?
So first is that there's many different strains of norovirus. So just like influenza, you may have protection against one strain, but a new strain may pop up in a couple of years. And this happened last year, actually, where a new strain popped up that people hadn't seen that much of before, and there were more cases than usual. The second answer is that norovirus is really smart and it infects a part of your gut called your small intestine. And here, the immune system works a little bit differently. We found that there's a different type of antibody, which is this like really sticky protein that acts like a wet blanket to block the virus from infecting you. And that type of antibody tends to be relatively short-lived. So we think that that antibody will stick around for a bit, but then it goes away so that the body's not wasting time making this antibody that isn't needed. And we think that makes people resusceptible. Now, we do think that when people get reinfected, that they probably do get less severe disease because they previously have some protection. And this is exactly what we see with COVID. But this term sterilizing immunity, where you get infected once and then never again, that is just not what happens with norovirus, like many other viruses like measles or rotavirus.
What are you doing then to try and realise your goal of actually making this less of an international disease burden?
Yeah, so recently a large randomized control trial of the first big human norovirus vaccine failed quite miserably. It was a multi-country study where they vaccinated thousands of infants, and the vaccine had 0% efficacy. And for us, this was really a big wake-up call, and I think for the field, which is we can't make a good vaccine and spend hundreds of millions of dollars trying to get it to work if we don't actually understand infection and how we can get an effective immune response to protect us against infection. So we wanted to take a step back and ask actually, what are the mechanisms that control infection? And to do this, we used mice. It's because in mice we could really control infection, we could control the virus, we could control the animals. And here we use this to basically make a model of human norovirus and ask what are the mechanisms and what parts of the immune system are necessary and sufficient to protect us from infection. What the long-term goal is, can we now mimic this with a vaccine in a person?
What does it actually do in mice then? What have we been missing in people that you can now potentially see in mice with the mouse equivalent?
In humans, for many, many years, we knew that the major correlates of protection to infection were two different types of antibodies. One type of antibody called IgG, and this antibody circulates in the blood and is really easy to measure. Then there's a second antibody that tends to live in our saliva, in our secretions from our airway and nose, and in our intestines, and that's a type of antibody called IgA. And typically, if you get infected, IgA and IgG kind of go hand in hand and both go up and both go down together. But we didn't know which one of those, if either, was actually essential. So much of the vaccine research was, all right, let's just come up with a vaccine that could boost this blood IgG antibody because it's easier to measure blood than it is antibodies in the feces. But we didn't know that that was actually protective. So we actually asked which of these is essential. And it turns out that in mice, at least, only IgA was essential and IgG was not. And that was a fairly big surprise to us, given the human literature and the assumptions that we and others erroneously made over the years.
IgA is a form of antibody that gets secreted at various surfaces. Like you say, it's at our airways, it's in tears, genital secretions, and so on. So is the mechanism of defense against noro that you're outlining then that the body makes this antibody and it basically splurges it all over the intestinal lining, so it's there like a barrier? So if the virus does come again, the antibody's there ready to greet it.
Yeah, the really cool thing about IgA and what makes it special is that there's a little piece of IgA that is different than IgG that enables it to cross these semi-permeable barriers and cross from your blood to your intestines, or to cross from your blood to your tears or nasal secretions or breast milk. Um, and that's what makes it special, and that's what helps it fight infection in the gut before that infection can really take hold and replicate. The hard part about IgA, it's much harder to make vaccines that lead to higher IgA. It's pretty easy to make vaccines that lead to really good IgG responses.
And do you think you can surmount that then?
We do. We think it will take time and additional research. I think the first step that we identified is now that we know IgA is really important, we can now make this as our primary goal for a vaccine. There are several vaccine approaches that are being tested for influenza, for COVID, and for other infections that are really focused on IgA, but it is a difficult barrier to overcome. I think one thing that may work is making what's called a live attenuated vaccine, which is a weakened version of the virus. And we have this for polio virus, we have this for rotavirus. I think that might be the most effective approach for norovirus, but there's a lot of barriers for us to overcome scientifically to be able to get there. And then there's other approaches where maybe we need new vaccine platforms that can actually lead to IgA, and we and others are working on those as well.
Craig Weiland at Yale University in conversation with Chris Smith. That study has just been published in Science Translational Medicine.
The Naked Scientists podcast is produced in association with Spitfire, cost-effective voice, internet and IP engineering services for UK businesses. Find out how Spitfire can empower your company at spitfire.co.uk.
Music in the programme is sponsored by Epidemic Sound, perfect music for audio and video productions.
This is the Naked Scientist podcast with me, Rachel Ralph. Still to come, the best way to recycle plastic in a bid to keep it from our seas and landfill sites. But first, people who speak more than one language know what it is like to express the same idea in various ways, and a new study has found that this translation skill depends on a shared mental map of brain activity in an area called the hippocampus. The research, published in Cell, shows that most brain cells respond uniquely to each language, although a few cells respond similarly to matching words, such as the Spanish tierra and the English earth. Even though brain cells change their responses for each language, the overall pattern, or the way ideas connect in the brain, remains consistent across languages. Benjamin Hayden from Baylor College of Medicine has been speaking with Chris Smith.
The question here is, how does the bilingual brain represent the same information in two different languages at the same time?
Why is that even a question, though? Why do we think that that ought to be a neurological challenge? Because we know the brain does it brilliantly. Some people speak multiple, like 7 languages. You give an example in the paper of Arnhem Land in north of Australia, where people routinely speak 7 languages.
Right. Think about it for a little bit. It becomes really, really complicated because if you speak 2 languages and somebody asks you a question in one language, you're going to know to answer in that language. And if you cross the border into a different country, you're going to know to use that language. So you can keep those languages separate in your mind. At the same exact time, if somebody tells you a story in Spanish, and then they ask you, or somebody else asks you a question in English a few minutes later, you can do that translation in your head. So you have a general representation, but it's also a different representation. And so getting that simultaneous general and different, that's the really hard part.
In other words, you can listen to the story in Spanish, but you'll know the answer to an ensuing question in English instantly. So you must be experiencing the representation irrespective of the language, but both are available to you instantly somehow.
Yeah, you can do it the general and you can do the distinction at the same time. You can keep them separate, but you can also let them blend. And that actually turns out to be a really, really hard problem.
I suppose in a research perspective, it's also tricky because we are unique in using language the way we do, having the language we do, and therefore you can't just ask a mouse to do this for you.
Right, absolutely. It would be really great if we could stick an electrode in the mouse brain, but we don't have any mice that can speak Spanish or German or any other language.
That we know of, apart from Mickey Mouse, possibly.
That's
right. But you have got humans, though.
Right. So we have this very rare and special population of humans that have severe epilepsy, chronic epilepsy. It's so bad that it won't respond to any other treatments. They're getting 10 to 50 electrodes implanted in their brain to monitor where the epilepsy is coming from so that the surgeons can treat it. We come into the clinic when one of these people is a balanced bilingual, and it just by chance we happen to have a bunch of English and Spanish speakers because we're in Houston, Texas, and we ask them to listen to an audiobook in English and then the same audiobook in Spanish. And then we have them have a conversation with us in English, and then we have somebody who works in our group who has a conversation with them in Spanish as well. And so we can look at how the brain represents the English and the Spanish.
This is by eavesdropping on different nerve populations with those electrodes that are in there.
That's exactly right, yes.
And
yes.
the electrodes are in the right bit of the brain that corresponds to where you're interested in.
That's right. These are electrodes that are in the hippocampus of the brain, which represents a lot of the kind of basic structured information that we deal with, including language.
And what do these electrodes do? When a person's listening to the English story or the Spanish story, what do you see them doing?
Yeah, so every single word that you hear elicits a pattern of activation in these neurons. If there's maybe 100 million neurons in the hippocampus, typically about 10% of those neurons are going to fire in response to any given word. And some neurons have higher firing rate. These are spiking activity from these neurons. Some neurons are going to have lower, and they're going to create a pattern of activity, and that's what we're measuring.
And is it the same neurons regardless of whether it's English or Spanish that a person's hearing?
It had been assumed for a long time that there was going to be a Spanish part of the brain and an English part of the brain. And what we can find, I think for the first time ever with this study, is that that just isn't true. Not only is it not separate neurons, it's the same neurons, but they're not representing the same thing. So if I hear the word five and if I hear the word cinco, which is the Spanish word for five, it's not going to be the same neuron representing that. It's not going to even be the same 10% of neurons, but the pattern is going to have some similarities anyway.
How on earth does that work then? If you've got the same cell lighting up when they hear two different things, or rather the same thing, but it's recruiting different groups of nerve cells, how on earth do we make sense and have that general picture, that general understanding of the story, regardless of whether it's in English or Spanish?
Yeah, that was kind of the hardest part of the study for us, and there's a lot of advanced math in it, but I'll try to explain it as clearly as possible. Imagine the word dog and cat. Dog and cat mean almost exactly the same thing. They both have 4 legs. They both live in your house. You take them both to the vet. And then imagine the word fork. Fork means something completely different. It's used in totally different situations. The pattern of neural activity in the hippocampus when you hear dog and cat is similar. It's not identical because dog and cat aren't the same thing, but it's similar. So there's a pattern of activation among these 100 million neurons. And the pattern for fork is basically completely a different pattern. So those 3 things together have a mathematical relationship that describes them. Now imagine your entire lexicon of 100,000 words of all the words that you know. That creates some giant web. And the web shape is basically the way that the language is represented in the brain. Your web for English and your web for Spanish have basically the same shape, although they're not the same neurons involved. So if you can look at the shape of that response, the shape of that web, then you can infer what these words mean.
So the brain has its own thought process, that it has an understanding or a concept or a mental picture, and the language that it expresses in or receives information in, that lies upstream of that picture. So it's like the brain's got a common encoding for what something is, and it then has to convert that back out into a language, or it receives it via that language. But the actual brain impression of the thing, the dog, the cat, the fork, that lies downstream of this interpretative mechanism.
I think that's exactly right, yes.
Now we know this. What does this unlock for us? Apart from being academically extremely satisfying that we've got a bit further down this pathway that was previously a closed door to us, what can we do with the information you've now elicited with this?
The real goal here is to understand how concepts are represented in the brain and how thoughts are represented in the brain. And we see language as a tool for studying that. But ultimately, what we really want to do is treat diseases like Alzheimer's disease, where people either lose their concepts, conceptual representation, or they have them, but they lose access to them. And we want to figure out how to recover those. In order to do that, we need to understand this very basic thing about how thoughts and concepts are represented in the brain.
Benjamin Hayden at Baylor College of Medicine speaking with Chris Smith, and that study was recently published in the journal Cell. Recycling gives our old stuff a second life, and it keeps it out of landfills and oceans. When it comes to recycling, we usually have 2 options. One is source separation, which is sorting our waste at home. The other is post-sorting, where everything goes into one bin and is sorted at a facility later. A recent study looked at both methods. Post-sorting can catch more plastic, but it also lets in unwanted materials such as dirt, moisture, and even dangerous metals like lead and cadmium. These make recycling harder, lower the quality of recycled materials, and can even be risky to our health. The researchers say post-sorting is helpful, but it can't replace sorting at home. Stephen de Meester from Ghent University shares his findings with Chris Smith.
Plastic recycling rates in general are too low all around the world, below 10%. And what we see from every analysis is that how much plastic we collect for recycling is the most sensitive parameter to really increase the recycling rates. Well, there are two ways of collecting plastic waste. Either there is what is called source separation, which means that inhabitants of a country separate their plastic packaging like bottles, trays, and films in a separate bag or bin, and then it's separately collected. And then later it goes to a sorting plant where these bottles and trays and films are separated from each other. The other way is post-sorting. And post-sorting means that the inhabitants and the households don't do the sorting and throw everything in a residual bin. And then this residual bin is collected, and then machines try to separate the bottles, trays, and films out of mixed waste. But of course, that mixed waste then contains other items like textiles, a lot of organic waste, and so on. Now, if we want to increase the recycling rates in the world, we need to get more plastic out of the waste and more collection. What you see is that some countries do this source separation already very intensively, like Belgium, but other countries, for example in the US, it's not a habit to do this separate collection. And there is a big debate in countries and waste management communities. Should we introduce more separate collection, or can machines do it? And countries that don't do this source separation should just invest in more machinery to get the plastic out of residual waste. So what we wanted to do is put some evidence on the table. Does it now make sense to do this source separation, or shall we trust the machinery to sort it out of our residual waste and don't bother the inhabitants to do this source separation at home?
The ultimate goal then is to try and drive up that pretty dismal rate of recycling of plastics. I'm quite frankly shocked it's as low as 10%, especially judging by how much goes in my bin at home. I mean, obviously, one thing to do is to cut down the amount we use in the first place, but that's a different story. And the question then is, well, do we get people to do this at home, or do we get machines to do it? What's going to translate into the bigger number? That's effectively your starting point, isn't it? What's going to get us a superior amount of recycling, whether we get people doing it or machines doing it?
Exactly. That was the setup of the study. And important in plastics is that it's not only the quantity that matters, but also the quality that matters. So I can for sure agree that post-sorting ramps up the quantities of material available for recycling, but the quality of the material is super important, and it should be safe, it should have the right colors, should have the right properties. So it's also a lot about quality of the material that comes out of the system and not only about quantity.
How did you do this then to try and get a handle on what would happen if you had a policy where we just get machines to do it versus a policy where people do this at home more?
So what we did, we went to a sorting plant in the Netherlands that takes both source separated waste and post-sorting, where the machines try to separate it from residual waste. So we went to this plant and looked how do these sorted bottles come out of that plant from both systems. Bottles, trays, tubs, films, and so on. So we looked at different items. At the output of the sorting plant, what is the quality at that moment from both systems?
How much rubbish did you consider? Was it a big sample? Did you do this over a long period of time, for example?
Well, waste sampling looks very simple, but it is not, because plastic is inherently complicated and you need a complete analytical lab to do it. So the first thing we did was checking how much moisture and dirt, remaining yogurt or meat that there is, but also you have to look deeper on the chemical level to odorous substances, which are then volatile, and you have to use chromatographic techniques, and you have to use, you analyze metals, chlorine, bromine, so the halogens. So you need a whole array of analytical chemical analysis to do this kind of characterization. The downside of that is that you cannot do this for years and years in hundreds of spots. You have to make a little bit of selection. So we only monitored one sorting plant over a limited period of time, and we had to collect samples, 60 liters per sample. And 60 liters in essence is not that much, but we sampled these 60 liters by what is called the quartering method. So you start from a bigger sample, homogenize, take some quarters out of it, mix again, homogenize, take quarters out of it, until you have your sample.
What did you find then? What's the outcome? What's the pro? What's the con of the two systems? And what, therefore, should the world do to improve on that 10% rate?
Well, one conclusion is that, for example, if you have a polyethylene bottle bale, so an output of a sorting plant, from both systems, it contains equal amount of polyethylene in the output. But what we also found is that there's way more odor that is difficult to remove. Furthermore, you get non-packaging objects in your output of the sorting plant. So this includes textiles, toys, and so on, which means that there is a chance that more hazardous substances come in the output of the sorting plant. And if we want to use this material, that we have to be very careful where we're going to use it and how to decontaminate this stream, and that we should use a little bit of precautionary principle and not just convert it to packaging again, because then we have contact to our food. So we have to be very careful if we do this sorting of residual waste, because basically the machines that do the sorting, they select on polymer type. They don't select on application type, and which might introduce hazardous substances in the recyclate.
Therefore, do you think we need a sort of two-tier system where to get recycling rates up, we settle for the fact we're going to have more contamination risk, but we can limit what we do with those outputs versus the citizens are sorting it for us, and we know that's going to lead to a purer waste stream, and that we could hive off and use for other higher end applications? Is that how you would see this working, or do we just have to live with the compromise? It's dirtier, we'll limit what we do with that plastic, but we will get more recycled.
Europe has what is called recycled content target, which means that by 2030, 30% of our packaging has to consist of recycled plastic. So we need this plastic to fulfill our legal targets by 2030. And these are quite sensitive applications. And for me, the conclusion is that it's not that easy to rely on post-sorting residual waste to fulfill the recycled content targets in these sensitive applications. So we should still really focus on introducing more source separation with the inhabitants to get a high quality material. And furthermore, as an addition, we can consider post-sorting. But we shouldn't just say the machines will solve it and the inhabitants don't need to do it, and we will only rely on post-sorting. It's not that simple.
Stephen de Meester at Ghent University speaking with Chris Smith, and that study was recently published in the journal Nature. That's it for today, but tune in on Tuesday when our Titans of Science series returns. We'll be hearing from the world-leading neuroscientist and dementia expert Tara Spires-Jones. We'll have our usual updates on LinkedIn, X and Instagram, and if you'd like to support our work, you can do so at thenakedscientist.com/donate. I'm Rachel Ralph, and from the rest of the team at The Naked Scientists, thanks for listening, and until next time, goodbye.